Hello. In this presentation I wanted to show you and talk to you about a very important aspect of Java, and that is its documentation. Now, the documentation string is kind of like the multi-line documentation string, but the main thing is it starts with a / and double asterisk, okay, and closes with a single asterisk. Now, the in-between simple asterisks are just for pretty output. The only thing that you require is the / double asterisk and the asterisk / to close it. Now, in the Java documentation tags, in this docstring, we have parameters. So classes have tags that we can use, and methods have tags that we can use. Now, docstrings are required for every class and every method. So if you have an extra method, like in this case function1, we have to give it some kind of a description. What is this function supposed to do? Not why I'm writing this function, but the functionality of this particular method. So you need to describe what this method is going to accomplish. Make sure that the description is meaningful and gives some meaning to another programmer. Remember, this description we don't write for users. We write these descriptions for other programmers. So programmers can use our methods in their programs. If we don't have the source code, we have to rely on this documentation. So the documentation for methods have tags. In this particular case, we have one parameter. That means we're gonna have a param tag that starts with an end symbol and all lowercase word param. After that, A is the variable, and after that is the description for the variable. In this case, the return is void, so it does not going to return anything in this particular case. So we can still use the tag return, and even though the function doesn't use anything to throw, we can still use the tag throw. Now, the classes going to have authors and versions. So who is the author for this particular class, and what is the version that we're gonna use? Now, some people puts in date when the program was completed, or it might be a numerical format. Okay. Now, in this case, the function one, when you have multiple parameters, then you have to use multiple param tags. So in this case, we have the parameter value. So what we need to describe is the value variable. Now, it is not just an integer, but what is it that we're going to do with that value? So when we are describing the actual variable, we need to talk about what is the purpose for this variable. In this particular case, we're going to be working with this variable, and we're just going to increment it by 5. Okay? But the programmer needs to know why would I need to supply you the value for the variable value. So you need to give it some kind of a description. So in this case, we have two param tags, one return and one throws tag. Those would be the most commonly used tags for methods. Now, if we have a return value of Boolean, okay, then now we're gonna have to have the keyword return, and then we can return either true or false. Now, in this case, when you are describing the return tag, it's not the variable. If you're returning a variable, it's not about the variable. It is describing what is it that I can expect out of this function. So in this particular case, we're going to always return true. Okay? But you might have to have, you might make some kind of a decision. If you supplied an integer, I return true. If you supplied a double, then I might return false. Okay? So don't list the variable you're returning. Explain what is it that you return. And if you throw any kind of exception, then you also have to describe what kind of exception that you are throwing. Okay. Now, some compilers will work with these tags and ignore some of these tags, like BlueJ. Not going to complain that we're not throwing anything and we're still using the tag throws. We are just using them at this point just so we get used to it. Okay, let me just save all this somewhere so then we can generate the actual documentation. So just gonna call it docstring practice, and we're gonna save the source code in this particular folder. Remember, we have to call the source code exactly the same way as we defined it as a class. So in this case, it's going to be capital H, capital W, hello world.java is my source code. At that point, we can switch over to command line. So just type in cmd, and we can generate the documentation for this code. But first we have to go to the proper folder. So first I switched over to my C drive. Remember, just there is no CD in front of it. It's just the drive letter, colon, press enter. So I was on my U drive by default, so now I'm on C drive, and now I can type in the temp, because I want to go to the temp/docstring practice directory. And at that point, I type in dir to list my files in this directory. And here's my hello world.java. So now, when we have JavaDoc, we can generate the documentation. Now remember that you have to install JDK in order to have access to JavaDoc. And you might have to watch my video on how to create or how to set my environmental variables in order to have access to JavaDoc. But that's all we need. We need JavaDoc and the source code. And in this particular case, you can see that we are not throwing anything. And if we are generating the documentation with JavaDoc directly, it will complain that we are specifying return and throws tags while not returning anything, or we are not throwing anything. So you either remove those tags, or you can use another IDE to compile your code. Okay. In this particular case, I'm just going to choose to remove them. Okay. So this is only relates to the documentation, not the code. It's just the documentation what it is checking. So you can rerun the same command, JavaDoc utility with the source code. And now it compiled perfectly fine. So no error messages. Now you can look at your documentation, the index.htm, in the folder where you created your documentation, and you can see that you have your method description and parameter. If you are returning something, there is a description for the return value. Make sure you read that, and read it from a point of view like you've never seen this class before, you've never seen this program before. If you would try to use, let's say, function 1, what would function 1 require? What would be the parameters? What would it return? What is the purpose of function 1? So if you look at it from another programmer's point of view, I'm sure it's going to make more sense why we create this. Also for the class, make sure you look at the author and the version, and make sure that you take credit for the work that you do. Okay? Make sure that you keep track of the versions, so you know which is your latest version that you are creating. And you might put in some kind of details as well on what updates that you have in your application. So for the version, you can put in either date or numerical format. In the numerical format, usually it is minor and major numbers. So major number, kind of intermediate kind of a number, smaller mistakes, and then you have your minor number, but the minor number might be just spelling mistakes or documentation updates. Okay, so this is my first version, and I haven't made any kind of mistakes yet. Okay, so in this case, the numbers mean major dot minor dot micro changes. Okay, so if I made a huge mistake, I would change the major number. If it's intermediate kind of a mistake, the middle number. And if there's some formatting issues or spelling issues, I would probably change the macro. Okay, it doesn't really matter how you keep track of your code, but make sure you do keep track of your code and take credit for the work that you do when you're creating these classes. Now, depending how you run the documentation, author and version might or might not show up. Okay, and this is that you might practice when you are generating the documentation. Okay, so in this case, you see that I don't see the author and the version. So in order to figure out why is JavaDoc does not display that, you might call up the help. Help is JavaDoc space help. And going through all the options, okay, you might see in this particular case, the provided by standard doclet, you can see that the version and the dash version and dash author is included if you put those two options into JavaDoc. So when I regenerate this documentation, we can specify dash version and then dash author before we have the source code. And now when we generate this Java documentation, and then reopen the index.html file that we just generated, now you can see the version and the author now shows up. Now notice that in the version, even the comment showed up. So don't put in the comment on the version tag line, because it will also be in your documentation. Okay, so again, you need to look at all your methods. Is the documentation, the description makes sense or not? And if the variables, the parameters don't make sense, like in this case, let's say A. What is A? I don't know what A is. Well, the string to be received. What is value? Well, the value, when you send this function the value, it is going to be incremented by 5. That's all it does. What is it going to return? Well, in this case, it's just a simple sample method, so it's going to return, always going to return true. Okay, but that's what it does. So since the function doesn't do anything else. I can't say anything else about this function. Now the documentation in this case is in the same folder as my source code. So it's a very bad practice, a very bad programming practice. So let me just get rid of it. Don't get rid of your source code. Okay, delete all the documentation related files. So what it would be normal is to generate the documentation into a separate folder away from my source code. So going back to help for JavaDoc, you can see that there is a way to list our destination directory for our output files or documentation. So that would be -d with the directory name. So in this case, I want to show up version, I want to show up author, but at the same time I also want to put all the documentation in DOC folder under my project folder. So this is a relative path right now. So usually you would see documentation in the DOC folder. So we specify that argument with the option -d. Okay. So now when you generate the documentation going to be separate from the source code. So it's not going to be as busy looking like it was before. I still have the source code by itself, and then the documentation in a separate folder. So it's a much better file management. Okay, and author and version still shows up. So I would recommend that you practice this. Okay, even though IDEs will generate all this automatically for you, knowing how to do it on the command line is always going to be the skill that you rely on, because it makes you understand technology much more. Okay, so if I want to do the same thing in BlueJ, so first you want to do it in Notepad and command line. Okay, and then you want to practice with your IDEs, whatever IDE that you're using. In this case, I'm just going to copy paste my source code. I'm going to create a class. It doesn't matter what I call the class, because we're going to replace all the source code with the source code that we wrote before. Source palette. Okay, and we don't really need to compile it neither. So let's just make a little mistake or some kind of a change in order to fix this code. Okay, so we added the second value. So we have two parameters now. Okay, now it compiles. But we really don't have to compile it, because compiling the code is not required for generating documentation. So the generating of the documentation does not check for syntax errors for the code. It does check documentation problems. Okay, so in BlueJ we can just switch between source code and documentation. Okay, so let me show you where my project is, the BlueJ project. Cool. Okay, so here's my hello world.java. I also have the hello world.class already, because I compiled it, but there is no other folders. But when you look at the source code, you switch over to documentation, you can see how DOC shows up, and you see the documentation right away. So BlueJ makes it much easier. You don't have to know anything about options and directory, how to specify a directory. So everything is done for you automatically. Makes our life much easier, but at the same time, it takes away that knowledge of command line generation. And you can also see that we have returns, and we can put back the throws tag. You can see how forgiving BlueJ is. So if we have multiple parameters in this case, even though I don't have multiple parameters, and even if we put the tag throws back into the documentation, and JavaDoc was complaining about that we're not throwing anything. When we're looking at the documentation, you can see that you can practice that, even though you don't know what throwing any kind of exception is, or you don't feel comfortable with multiple parameters. You can put those tags in, generate the documentation, and just read it. See if you find it useful, or see if it makes sense to you. Okay, you can practice this. BlueJ makes it so much easier to generate and regenerate the documentation. Practice different values. Practice different parameters. Right? It will not complain about you not using it properly. So don't be afraid of it. Okay, and if you remove some, you can see it's gone. Okay, one mouse click, that's all it takes to practice this really important feature in the Java programming language. Okay, so what does that look like in Eclipse? Okay, so again, just start any kind of a project just to practice it. Is not about really the project, what you are doing right now. You just want to figure out, how do I use Java documentation in different IDEs? But you will see that you have to know what JavaDoc.exe is. Okay, not having the JDK installed and properly installed will not help you in this particular case. So again, it doesn't matter what I call the class, because we're going to replace the source code. Okay, I'm going to leave the package information intact. Okay, and right now the source code name is wrong, so let Eclipse fix it for us. And now we can start generating the documentation. So let me show you the folder for the project. So this is the source code. We can compile it, and we can see the outcome or the output, and that's perfectly fine. But so you can see that compiling the code does not give you any kind of errors or warning about documentation strings. So it will completely ignore that. Okay. In this particular case, we're just going to look at objects, class, and the hash value for each one of the classes. But that's not the important one, right? Okay. And then you have the compiled code. Okay, so here's the source code. Now we need to figure out, how do we generate the documentation? So under project, simply just click on generate JavaDoc. Now the first time you run this, you need to tell Eclipse where your javadoc.exe file is, well, which is basically in the same folder as you installed the JDK. And this is the default folder when it will generate the documentation too. You can see it is the DOC folder. Like I said, DOC is pretty common and pretty standard to put the documentation files into. So Eclipse gonna use the DOC folder. So now you navigate where your javadoc is. So C java bin, here's a javadoc.exe, and that's what you want to set for Eclipse to use whenever you're gonna generate Java documentation. And this can be a newer or older version, but usually you want to use the same javadoc that your JDK is using. So make sure or double check that this is a correct path to your executable. Okay, and we just gonna generate the Java documentation. Now remember that Eclipse uses JavaDoc. Okay, so here's the documentation, and you can just open up the index.html file, which is the documentation. Okay, so what happens if I don't have a return value and I only have one parameter, not two parameters? Again, we're going to generate the Java documentation with the wrong tags for main. See what happens. Okay, so this time it remembers the path to JavaDoc. And here's our two errors. Okay, the errors will actually have the line and the source code line numbers where the error occurred, and it's a clickable link, so you can even click on the link. It will take you exactly to the line that caused this error. In this case, we really need to remove it. Okay, and we do not have any return value coming out of main, so return is not a tag that we should be using with this method. And you can regenerate the documentation as many times as you want. Fix one error and then regenerate it. Okay, usually we fix one thing at a time. Okay, so now we click on the second one. Oh, that's the problem. We have a return value even though the function says void. So it's a void function. It should not have a return tag. And this time it compiled just fine. And you can see the documentation. Okay, the version shows up, the author shows up. Okay, we have the methods, we have the method descriptions, and we have the attributes and the return value, or all the different tags that we are able to use at this point for each one of those functions. So Eclipse is a little bit different from BlueJ, but the most useful way of generating this would be on command line. before you would move into any kind of a GUI environment and use any kind of a IDE. And make sure you understand that some IDEs are more forgiving. So like BlueJ is more forgiving when generating documentation, because it allowed us to generate the documentation with wrong tags, while Eclipse enforced us to fix all the problems and remove tags that were not required or not needed for the documentation to work. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you find it useful. See you next time.